This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. Happy New Year, everyone. I hope you all had a chance to unplug a little bit over the holiday and relax a bit after this very challenging year. Before our break, we had several episodes where we discussed the Debt for Nature swaps that were sponsored by the Nature Conservancy in both Belize and Seychelles. But today we have an opportunity to look at debt swaps from a different angle. We are joined by Esteban Brenes, who is Director of Conservation Finance at the World Wildlife Fund. Esteban, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you for inviting me to the program.
So we have a lot of ground to cover, but first I want to take pause and recognize a great loss that we had over the holiday. Thomas Lovejoy, who coined the phrase biodiversity and is recognized to be the first to have conceived of debt for nature swaps, passed away on Christmas Day. And I just learned that you had the opportunity to work with him at the World Bank. I unfortunately never met with him or had that opportunity. So could you tell us a bit about him?
Yeah, sure. Well, it was 25 years ago. I was a young consultant fresh out of grad school. It happened that my office was next to his, and we met on the hall, and he asked me about what I was doing, where I was from, and I guess the fact that I was from Costa Rica caught his attention. Also, at that time, I was starting to work on a project from the World Bank supporting ecosystem services payments, and I think that one of the greatest things that Mr. Lovejoy had, or Tom, was that he understood how complex the tropical forests work, and he also understood that economics and finance was complex as well. But if there was not an alignment between the importance of the tropical forest and finance, that tropical forest didn't have a chance to survive as an ecosystem. So I think that was one of his greatest aspects that he had, was that he had that vision. So he was always supporting and pushing innovative mechanisms like the ecosystem services payments. And also back in the 80s, he knew a lot of people in the finance sector. His family, his father was an executive in an insurance company in New York. So he was well connected and familiar with that sector. And, he always said that he didn't invent anything, that he took the concept of swaps from the private sector, from the private finance, and applied it for the use of debt swaps for nature, or to benefit nature and conservation. So I think that was he was great at that way. He was an innovator, not only in science, but in, if you can call it, green politics, and in finance. So, and he was also a great mentor, which I was very fortunate to benefit from that. But there were dozens of people around the world who also had stories about Mr. Lovejoy being very helpful.
It's been very touching reading all of the tributes to him online. I've been seeing them on LinkedIn and Twitter, and it's remarkable what he's done. And even though I didn't have the chance to work with him, but I know that many of you who did, hopefully we can continue on his legacy and working on these issues. So you've been focused on sustainable finance for, I guess over 20 years. And as you mentioned, you're from Costa Rica. So you've had quite a lot of experience in debt swaps from both, I think, commercial debt as well as bilateral debt, but particularly in the bilateral debt with the TFCA, the Tropical Forest Conservation Act of the US. You also were a board member at Forever Costa Rica, which was involved in those swaps. Could you tell us a little bit about those?
Costa Rica was declared eligible for debt for nature swaps under the Tropical Forest and Coral Conservation Act in the 2000s. There were some issues with the expropriations of U.S. nationals, and those were resolved. And I know that Mr. Portman, who was the senator who pushed the FCA, he was pretty much the one who came up with the legislation. It was also a big a matter of Costa Rica, and that also was very helpful. So there were two swaps done for around between the two of them around $45 million. And Forever Costa Rica was part of a of the structure of a broader initiative called Forever Costa Rica, and there was this was a legal entity incorporated in Costa Rica that manages a trust that channels monies for conservation activities in the country. So there was an exercise done to prioritize the activities and the geographies within Costa Rica that needed expansion for protection. So there was a lot of work done with support from the Nature Conservancy and many private donors and foundations, the Moore Foundation, Larry Linden Trust, and others to come up with this idea. And the concept was to use Costa Rica as in many other instances, as a lab for the concept. And now it's being implemented in other countries as well.
So Costa Rica was one of the first of the TFCA.
No, TFCA is not really, but the use of the Debt for Nature swap for a broader concept of taking a look at conservation needs nationally. That's where the innovation came from. There were swaps in the past. Costa Rica, Bolivia did some in the 80s. But this was like a new way of implementing the debt swaps. And in my function in the board of Forever Costa Rica, which was the legal entity managing this, was to help launch this new legal entity, do all the, try to work on the nuts and bolts of governance, implementation, monitoring. Because one thing that is very important for debt swaps, not only for the US ones, but in general, especially bilateral ones, and the new generation of private commercial ones, is indicators. More than the financial transaction, you need to show impact. And this is becoming more and more important for private institutions, finance institutions, but also in the case of the TFCCA, for the U.S. Congress, that pays a lot of attention on the outcomes of the monies used for the swaps.
Mm-hmm. Would you use the term in this case of the key performance indicators, or is it just a more general kind of impact?
The implementation, how decision making was made, and also help hire the technical staff and people to develop the indicators of impact. And this is also also important to understand that this was only in agreement with the Costa Rican government because they needed to. Is the national park system that is as a public system so they needed to be in agreement with the implementation of and the use of the funding.
So I guess that's where the challenges really happen. I mean, the debt swaps and the financial aspects of it, there's a lot of moving parts. And as we've seen in these other cases that we've talked about, there's a lot of, institutions involved. But you can share with us a little bit more, perhaps, about the implementation side of the kind of what happens on the government side when you're actually trying to push this through through a political process, as well as then actually implement the conservation.
Actually, the reason why it's so important to have very clear goals and objectives and indicators is to try to steer governments away. And this is not only the case of Costa Rica, governments in general, they always, especially in the environmental sector, is usually understaffed and under budget. So there's always this temptation to just cover their everyday costs. Gas for cars and boots for rangers and things of that sort. But the idea is to actually have be more strategic and have a longer term vision about what you want to achieve. And so the logic is that you build up, it's almost like doing some sort of blending in the sense that the government needs to commit with their public funding and swaps, the swap funding and other private or philanthropic funding will help push the government to go beyond business as usual. I think that's the added value of these projects, is that you establish a goal in 10, 15 years to reach a level of effective management, as they call it in conservation, of the of the protected areas, or in some cases, new protected areas that are created. So you don't have the syndrome of paper parks where you have lines drawn on a map, but there's no enforcement and very little conservation being done in those places. And that's the biggest challenge. And I think that's where swaps and other mechanisms could be a very effective tool to achieve conservation.
Because they bring in these other entities that are kind of providing not only funds but also presumably technical assistance and other scientific support for those conservation goals.
Yes, and also there's a little bit of a discipline there, because the sort of the sequencing is that first of all you try to come up with an objective or goal that translates into conservation activities that then you need to cost out. You come up with a price tag, and then you can you project that over time. So it's like running a small company. It's like running a company. You come up with a business plan, you figure out how much it costs, and then you try to, over a period of time, try to achieve the goals of that business plan. They don't call them like that, but that's the same logic. This is something that the private sector has been doing for decades. But in the conservation world, we're somewhat behind in that management style.
Mm-hmm. So in the modern debt swaps that we were looking at, and I know you're familiar with, in Belize and other places, this was the marine spatial plan that they've been talking about, which is, as you would say, like kind of this goal and kind of list of activities.
Exactly. And also that even, and now if you add climate, it's even more important, because in climate you have to have longer term visions and goals if you want to achieve your any of the, you want to get the benefits of climate adaptation or mitigation. So that sort of logic or discipline is even more important in the context of climate. So yeah, it's a way of doing things differently and try to get the governments from their everyday budget cycles that tend to be 1 or 2 years, 3 years at the most, and they don't have time to really think and plan ahead. It's very difficult for government officials to do that, and it's not because it's not necessarily their choice. That's how the system works. And I think this is where, apart from funding, there's an added value in coming up with a different logic on how do you do things.
Mm-hmm. Well, because it's also you're also trying to get them to think beyond a political cycle, right?
Exactly.
I mean, because presumably there's always elections coming, or some other pressures from a political calendar, and unfortunately climate and nature don't play by those calendars.
Exactly.
So in the case of Costa Rica, when you were under the TFCA with the US government, the debt that was being swapped was bilateral debt owed to the United States. My question is, for that model, which is different than the other ones we've kind of been looking at, for that model, how involved, and you can answer specifically for this deal or just generally, how involved does the kind of the donor government, in this case the US, that's willing to kind of forego their debt in return for these conservation outcomes, how involved are they in the planning normally, or in kind of the implementation phase of it, or is that just kind of a financial thing that happens up front?
No, actually the U.S. government's represented. It's a tripartite sort of work within the U.S. government that includes U.S. Treasury, which leads, then U.S. State Department, and usually the local USAID mission. That's been my experience in the other swaps I worked on their TFCA, which are Paraguay, Colombia, Peru, and Indonesia, apart from Costa Rica. So there's a mix in which the U.S. Treasury, obviously they have their own accounting and budgeting processes that they also negotiate with their counterpart, which is the local Ministry of Finance in the government that is benefiting from the swap. And then State Department takes a look at the political requirements under the TFCCA Act, about being a democratic government and other requirements. And then the local USAID mission, typically because they do implement, in most cases, projects in the field, they do have a sense of how difficult things can be and what should be the priorities. So the U.S. government actually it participates in different aspects of the swap. But they're pretty flexible. They understand and they're very respectful of the government that is benefiting from the swap. And usually they want to listen on what the government, in this case, Costa Rica, to use for the argument, what Costa Rica wanted to do. And they're very flexible, they're open, they listen. And as I was saying earlier, they're really worried that the funding is used based on the payment schedule. As some of the listeners may know, they will follow the same payment schedule of the original debt, but done in local currency. So they're worried that, they care that the activities follow that payment schedule, so the investments are consistent with the amounts of money coming in, and that they can show results and concrete outcomes to the U.S. Congress, because they have to report back every year.
Right. Okay. So the debt relief component of it is really that it's been converted into local currency, and instead of paying just a foreign government, you're investing in your own nature and environment, and presumably, budget allocations that you would want to do anyway.
Exactly. And the idea also from, especially in the later years, there being around 22 swaps that have generated around $390 million in conservation activities. And there are two main modalities. One that is bilateral, where only governments participate, and the one that allows third parties, which have been typically US-based NGOs, that can come up with additional resources. That there's this rule that is not in the law, the act, but that usually they require at least 20% of the swap amount. And then the NGOs so far have more or less come up with $24 million in this 21 swaps that have been done since the act was created in 1998. So you can say that on average NGOs have leverage around 10 to 12% of the funding of the overall swaps being done.
And one of the reasons why we're kind of looking backwards at these previous swaps is because we're actually trying to solve the problems looking forward, right? And as you know, is even better than I do, that the official sector is searching for ways to assist countries in their efforts to adapt to climate change and to hopefully slow climate change. So I want to kind of look forward with you for a minute here, and maybe move to your current role at WWF. I know that they have a long partnership with loads of entities, but in particular, I want to focus on the African Development Bank, because I know together with Potomac Group, we're working on a study for the AFDB on the feasibility of debt swaps for African countries kind of going forward. Can you share with our listeners a little bit about WWF's work with the African Development Bank on this subject?
Well, WWF has had a presence in Africa for more than 50 years. Historically, WWF priorities have been in the tropical forests of the Central African region, and also in the southern part of Africa, especially amongst the countries of Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, parts of Tanzania, because of the big species, the big five species in the region that has been historical work that WWF has done. In terms of the work with Africa Development Bank, we have our Africa program, I've been working with them in exploring new ways to leverage resources for conservation, and now in the light of the pandemic, it's become even more urgent because many of the protected areas in the region, as in many other parts of the world, are heavily dependent on tourism. So there is a concern that now with less tourists coming in, the governments are really having a hard time paying the bills, so to speak, for protected areas, and this is where that issue was one of the aspects that was discussed and considered, and this is where, in that context, that's where we thought it would be good, and this is where Potomac Group came in to try to make an assessment to what could be a good policy framework for AFD to develop debt swaps, but also debt treatment overall. And I think it's very important, not only in the African context, but globally too, is to make that link on the recovery, during and after the pandemic, because as you said, looking back, we understand that swaps are useful, but they're a fairly small portion of the overall debt spectrum. And we feel strongly that we better, and countries will need debt. That is not necessarily, it's not inherently negative, but it needs to be well spent and well used. And I think that we have to do both. Think about how can we better use, how could we do new swaps and new structuring of existing debt, but also how can we use new debt so that there's a virtuous circle where we can improve the conditions of the countries in the Africa region in this case. So I think we need to also, it would be interesting to take a look at how can we better use existing debt, and also how can we come up with new ways of using financial mechanisms with new potential debt, so that we can have more impact. And that's where there are all these new ways of doing blended finance, or in some instances, impact investing could be of interest for these new ways of using debt. So I think we're thinking about the past, about swaps, but also how can we come up with new things for the future.
No, exactly. I think we're in total agreement that we have to kind of expand the toolkit, and there is this looking backwards at debt swaps, which were, as you said, kind of really popular back in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, and then they just kind of petered off for a variety of reasons. And so I think we need to kind of understand what those reasons were and maybe tweak the models a little bit and figure out how we can repurpose them for today's challenges, but also, as you say, kind of looking at other innovations that we can have, and these are all the the sustainability linked bonds. I mean, even beyond the kind of what we call the use of proceeds bonds, the green and blue bonds, for particular projects, but kind of other bonds that are kind of fluctuating based on performance against an indicator.
Exactly. Yeah, because we need to help countries. Climate adaptation, mitigation. It's for many countries, it's almost like science fiction. They can barely make ends meet, and we're asking them to completely change how their economies work. And so I think bonds and other financial tools could create incentives for them, because when we have dialogues with governments and local communities and NGOs in the countries, they always say they want us to do all these things, but we don't know how, or we don't have the resources. We need more help with that, not just get projects done out of the blue. They need more help and capacity building, which in many instances nobody wants to cover. So I think that's where blended finance and other approaches can be very beneficial.
And WWF would play a role in that, and in which way? For the technical assistance, or also providing finance?
I think our role, and we actually have a big discussion over this in the last 2 years. I think our priority is to make sure that by technical system that we make sure that whatever is called green is really green, because unfortunately it's a label that it's trendy these days. But sometimes
Yeah.
they don't have the criteria is very weak. So for us, the first priority is to make sure that that whatever is called green, it really pass pass the test. And
Right.
also we can, through our networks and contacts, we can also facilitate the institutions that really know about finance to get into the space. But we feel like the branding of WWF could be very beneficial. But we understand that our place is technical assistance and technical and green issues, but we're not a financial institution.
Right. But there's huge roles for, as soon as we start talking about any of this, sovereign debt linked to climate or nature, there's immediately all of the questions about the indicators, the monitoring. I mean, first of all, just the selection of the KPIs, and then it gets into
Exactly.
How do you monitor them? How do you verify them? How do you validate them to the extent so that an investor knows that they are getting what they thought they were investing in. Like you say, it's not just greenwashing. It's not just kind of putting a label on it. And the KPI bonds or the performance link bonds are going to be much more rigorous in those aspects.
Oh yeah, and also WWF offices across the world, and in Africa, we already have ongoing relationships with governments for many years. So they know us, they trust us. We also have relationships with local communities that could be benefits. So there's a lot of added value. Actually, we are right now, developing another part of the world. A scheme of microfinancing green projects with local communities and small and mid-sized companies with with a crowdsourcing institution, which still in the works. But that's where we feel that we can add value by making those connections and working with local financial intermediaries who know that space and that business. So this is a small pilot we're doing, but we hope that hopefully we can transfer that to Africa and Asia as well.
Brilliant. So I want to give you the last word. What would you like to say to debt managers or even other government officials, whether in Latin America, Africa, or any country vulnerable to the pandemic and to climate change? What would you like them to think about or warn them about any pitfalls as they go forward in this? Because you have just loads of experience of this from so many different angles.
Well, I think that that the swaps and any financial mechanism is not just about money. It's not about just numbers. It's about outcomes and results, and that we need to make sure that, of course, we need the funding to achieve any goal, but we need to make sure that the goal is realistic, that is achievable, and that we can measure it. And measure it in a simple manner, because complex or sophisticated impact measuring or monitoring can be very costly and expensive, and it's not practical. So, this is where there's always the devil's in details, and that implementing and the use of the resources, deployment of the resources is where actually you get outcomes. And I think people should not forget that. It's very important that we get better at implementing and measuring what we're trying to achieve.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today, Esteban. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and anytime I'll be happy to join again the program.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.